My father slid an $850,000 check to my sister and coldly told me, "Leave your keys on the counter." My father held the receipt from Chase Bank like it was a winning lottery ticket. "This is going to make our family legacy immortal," he announced, beaming across the kitchen island. He wasn't just funding my sister Celeste, he was funding her and my brother Ethan. Ethan giggled, adjusted his silk scarf, and kissed our father's forehead. The visionary, as always. I stood by the hallway arch with my half-packed suitcase, the room reeking of expensive sandalwood incense and blatant favoritism. The house had always felt like a stage set where I was the only one without a script, but today, the exclusion was financial, concrete. "What about my tuition?" I asked quietly. Dad didn't even blink. He wiped a smudge off the granite countertop. "You're 26, Maya. Time to be a woman. Ethan and Celeste are shifting global consciousness. What are you doing? Studying dirt, saving pennies?" Mom stirred her matcha at the breakfast nook, purposefully not making eye contact with me. "You could learn something from your siblings. They're manifesting a true empire." I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them that Ethan had abandoned 3 different majors, that Celeste had crashed 2 leased Mercedes in the span of a year, that they had drained our parents' retirement accounts twice before. I wanted to remind them that I had worked 60-hour weeks managing the books to keep our lights on when Dad's commercial contracting firm went under 4 years ago. But what was the point? The check was written. The delusion was sealed. "So I'm just supposed to leave?" I said, my voice dangerously close to breaking. "You need to learn independence," Dad said coldly. "Leave your keys on the counter." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door, and dropped it onto the granite. It made a sharp, hollow clatter. No one looked up. I drove away that Tuesday afternoon with $412 to my name and a 2008 Subaru Outback that shuddered every time I merged onto the highway. No safety net, no destination, just me heading north toward Denver. The silence in the car was deafening. I kept the radio off. I just listened to the engine whine and watched the suburban sprawl give way to the foothills. The first 2 weeks, I slept in the freezing parking lot of a 24-hour gym off Interstate 25. It was safe enough. The fluorescent lights from the lobby spilled onto the asphalt and kept the panic away. I cracked the windows just enough to prevent condensation from giving away that someone was inside. I showered using a cheap guest pass, timing it for 4 a.m. when the locker rooms were empty. I survived on bulk rice cooked on a portable camp stove I bought at a thrift store and bruised apples from the discount bin at a local grocer. But staring up at the frost-covered moonroof at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a cheap synthetic sleeping bag, I felt something entirely alien. Peace. Nobody was asking me to balance their overdrawn ledgers. Nobody was telling me my ambitions were small. I needed cash, fast. I found a graveyard shift at a commercial meatpacking plant on the industrial edge of the city. From 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., I hauled 40-pound crates of frozen pork shoulder from the flash freezers to the loading docks. The cold seeped through the thick rubber gloves and deep into my bones. By the end of the first week, my shoulders screamed with every movement. My hands were perpetually blistered. Every morning I would clock out, wash the smell of raw meat and bleach off my skin in the gym shower, and sit in the public library right at opening time. I claimed a corner table near the heating vent, cracked open my 5-year-old laptop, and got to work. I had always been obsessed with geospatial data mapping, analyzing soil erosion, building topographic models for fun, pulling satellite telemetry to predict structural shifts. Dad used to call it a geeky distraction when I tried to show him how it could save his contracting firm money. Now, it was my only weapon. I started cold emailing construction developers. I offered cheap, fast, freelance terrain analysis. "Before you break ground, let me tell you what's under it." For a month, nothing. Then, a small commercial developer named Owen Mercer replied. He was looking at a 40-acre plot outside Boulder and didn't trust the county surveyor's report. I pulled the satellite data, ran it through a custom script I wrote on the library's spotty Wi-Fi, and found a hidden subterranean drainage basin that would have flooded his foundation within 2 years. I saved him $3 million. He paid me $4,000. That check got me out of the Subaru. I rented a cramped studio apartment above a dry cleaner. It smelled perpetually of industrial solvent, but it had a lock on the door and a radiator that rattled all night. It was paradise. Slowly, other mid-sized firms took a chance on me. I started building a proprietary mapping software that could instantly detect environmental zoning hazards for commercial builders. I called it TerraLens. Meanwhile, Ethan and Celeste's venture was everywhere. They had pooled Dad's money and opened an ultra-luxury wellness retreat in Sedona. They called it Aura. It was absurd. $800 a night meditation yurts, crystal healing therapies, and celebrity endorsements. My parents flew down monthly, blasting their Facebook feeds with pictures of themselves drinking green juice by an infinity pool. "Our son, the spiritual CEO," Mom posted, alongside a photo of Ethan in white linen pants, looking thoughtfully at a cactus. "Our daughter, the wellness visionary," Dad wrote under a picture of Celeste holding a piece of rose quartz. I once saw Ethan in a glossy magazine spread, talking about healing the earth through luxury ecotourism. I read it while sitting in the meatpacking plant's windowless break room, eating stale crackers, smelling faintly of bleach and exhaustion. I threw the magazine in the trash and went back to the freezer floor. I kept my head down. I taught myself advanced drone surveying. A few mid-sized firms licensed TerraLens, then a major corporation. Within 18 months, I had 200 enterprise clients. The software automated what used to take engineering firms weeks of manual soil sampling and historical data pulling. I wasn't a billionaire, but the days of freezing in my Subaru were dead. Then the texts rolled in. First from Mom. "Maya, Ethan's retreat is dealing with local permit noise. You know about land stuff? Maybe you could call the county for him?" I deleted it. 2 weeks later, Dad. "Ethan wants to expand the yoga pavilions into the lower valley. Family helps family. Review his blueprints by Friday." I blocked their numbers. 3 years in, everything changed. TerraLens secured a massive $3 million government contract with the Department of the Interior to map shifting floodplains in the Pacific Northwest. I quit the meatpacking plant forever. I bought a high-rise condo in downtown Denver with floor-to-ceiling windows. I leased a commercial office space and hired 20 employees. My lead developer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Faye Durbin, optimized the code until it ran faster than anything on the market. We We were untouchable. That is when Ethan finally emailed me directly. Maya, he wrote, adopting a sickeningly professional tone that didn't suit him. I see you've built a little mapping firm. Congratulations. Listen, the EPA is harassing Aura over some silly wetland boundaries on our lower 40 acres. They're threatening to shut down the expansion. I need you to run a new survey and shift the topographical lines on paper. Make the wetlands disappear. It'll be great exposure for your brand. I sat in my corner office looking out at the Denver skyline and laughed out loud. He wanted me to falsify a federal environmental survey. He wanted me to commit a felony for the people who left me in a parking lot. I replied instantly. I'm laughing at the delusion that I would risk federal prison to save the people who threw me out. Do not contact me again. He replied 3 minutes later, dropping the professional act. You ungrateful bitch. I'll sue you for defamation. I ignored him. A month later it happened. My parents ambushed me in my office lobby. I was walking back from lunch with Faye when I saw them. Dad was pacing by the security desk, wearing a tailored suit that looked 10 years out of date. Mom was sitting on a leather bench, clutching a designer handbag. When Dad saw me, his face hardened. He didn't greet me. He just walked straight up and pointed a finger in my face. Stop being vindictive, he yelled, his voice echoing off the marble walls. The security guard placed a hand on his radio. Dad, I said, my voice perfectly flat. Lower your voice or I'll have you removed. Ethan is drowning in legal fees because of this EPA nonsense. Dad snapped, stepping closer. You have millions now. We saw the press release about the government contract. You owe us for pushing you to succeed. If we hadn't made you independent, you'd still be nothing. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had let me freeze in a car while he bought my brother a meditation yurt. I felt completely devoid of anger. It was just clinical disgust. You didn't push me to succeed, I said. You threw me away because I wasn't useful to your vanity. You gave him a fortune to play guru. We are entirely done. Escort them out, please. I turned my back and walked to the elevators. I heard Dad shouting something behind me. Heard the security guard asking him to step toward the glass doors, but I didn't look back. I thought that was the end of it. I thought setting a boundary in public would humiliate them enough to keep them away. I didn't understand how desperate they were. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a conference room reviewing the Q3 projections with Faye when my office phone rang. It was Garrett Voss, the corporate attorney I retained when I signed the Department of the Interior contract. Garrett was a pragmatist. He rarely called unless something was on fire. Maya, you need to come down to my office right now, Garrett said. I'm in the middle of Q3 review. Can it wait until 3? No, Garrett said, his voice completely devoid of its usual dry humor. You've been served. Served with what? A civil suit filed in the state of Colorado. The plaintiffs are your father, your brother Ethan, and your sister Celeste. They're suing you and Terra Lens for intellectual property theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate espionage. The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Faye, who was watching my face drain of color. What are you talking about? I managed to say. They don't know anything about mapping software. Your father is claiming that you developed Terra Lens while employed as the bookkeeper for his commercial contracting firm. He's claiming the foundational code was written on his company hardware, using his proprietary land surveys as the base data model. He says Terra Lens is legally the property of his former company. His company went bankrupt 4 years ago, I shouted, standing up so fast my chair hit the wall. He was a general contractor. He barely knew how to open a PDF. I built this in a public library on a broken laptop. I believe you, Garrett said calmly. But he's attached documents, signed employment agreements, and he's filed for an emergency injunction to freeze Terra Lens's assets until the ownership is resolved. My stomach dropped. The Department of the Interior contract. The federal government has strict clauses about vendor liability. If our assets were frozen, we couldn't deliver the Q4 mapping deliverables. If we missed the deadline, the contract would be voided, and we would owe the government penalties that would bankrupt the company. Garrett, if they freeze our accounts, we lose the federal contract. I know, Garrett said. Get down here. I left Faye in the conference room and drove across town to Garrett's firm. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The same hands that used to ache from hauling frozen pork were now gripping the leather wheel of a new Audi, trembling with a completely different kind of terror. When I walked into Garrett's office, he had files spread across his mahogany desk. He looked tired. Sit down, Garrett said, sliding a thick manila folder toward me. Look at Exhibit B. I opened the folder. It was a photocopy of an employee non-disclosure and intellectual property agreement. The header belonged to Dad's old company. The date was from 5 years ago, and at the bottom, sitting on the signature line, was my name. My blood went cold. I never signed this. Are you sure? Garrett asked, watching my eyes carefully. Because it looks exactly like your signature on the incorporation documents for Terra Lens. I stared at the loops of the letters. It was my signature, but I had never signed this piece of paper. Dad used to have me sign blank tax documents and vendor authorizations when I managed his books because he was always too busy to deal with the paperwork. He had taken one of my old signatures and transposed it. It's forged, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He copied it from a vendor ledger. Proving forgery takes time, Garrett said, leaning back in his chair. Time we don't have. The injunction hearing is in 9 days. If the judge grants it, your company accounts are frozen. Why are they doing this? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. I did some digging into your brother's LLC, Garrett said, tapping a pen against his desk. The Sedona Retreat. They didn't just get hit with an EPA fine. They're insolvent. The EPA shut down their expansion, which means they defaulted on the construction loans. They owe creditors close to $4 million. They are completely underwater. They don't actually want Terra Lens, Maya. They want a settlement. They are holding your federal contract hostage so you'll pay them to go away. Extortion. My own father was extorting me to save Ethan. I'm not paying them a dime, I said, my jaw tightening. If we go to court, it becomes public record, Garrett warned. The Department of the Interior monitors the legal status of all its primary contractors. If they see a dispute over the IP ownership of the software they are paying millions for, they will trigger a suspension clause. They won't wait for a verdict. They'll drop you. I felt the walls of the office closing in. The years of sleeping in the gym parking lot, the smell of bleach, the library computer. I had built myself out of nothing, and they were trying to drag me back down to pay for their delusions. What's our move? I asked. We depose them. Immediately, Garrett said. We get your father on the record before the injunction hearing. We push hard. People who forge documents usually crack under aggressive questioning. But you need to understand something, Maya. He is going to sit across a table from you and lie to your face under oath. It's going to get ugly. Schedule it, I said. 4 days later, I walked into a sterile conference room in downtown Denver for the deposition. Garrett was by my side. A court reporter sat at the end of the long glass table, setting up her machine. The door opened, and Dad walked in. He was flanked by a slick, expensive-looking lawyer. Dad looked older than he had in my lobby. The stress of Ethan's failing business was showing in the deep lines around his mouth, but his eyes were hard. He didn't look at me as he took his seat. Mom came in right behind him, sitting in the back corner of the room, clutching her purse. "State your name for the record," Dad's lawyer said to start things off. Garrett took the lead. He was merciless. He walked Dad through the timeline of his contracting business, the bankruptcy, the exact nature of the software he claimed I stole. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett said, holding up the forged NDA, "you claim your daughter developed a sophisticated geospatial mapping algorithm while managing your payroll, a technology your construction firm never utilized, marketed, or profited from. She was an employee," Dad said, his voice steady. "She used company time and company computers. The ideas generated in my office belong to my office." "Can you describe the code base?" Garrett asked. "Can you tell me what programming language TerraLens is written in?" Dad's lawyer intervened. "Objection. My client is a business owner, not a software engineer. He doesn't need to know the code to own the IP." Garrett smiled, a thin, sharp expression. "Let's talk about this signature then. You maintain you watched Maya sign this document on October 14th, 5 years ago?" "I did." Dad lied perfectly. He looked right at me for the first time. "She sat in my office and signed it. I told her that her little mapping hobby could be useful for the family business one day. Family helps family." The audacity of the phrase made my stomach churn. Garrett slid another piece of paper across the table. "This is a flight manifest from Delta Airlines. On October 14th, 5 years ago, Maya was in Chicago attending a logistics seminar you sent her to. She was not in your office. She was 1,000 miles away." Dad didn't flinch. His lawyer quickly put a hand over the microphone. They whispered furiously for 30 seconds. "My client misspoke regarding the exact date," the lawyer said smoothly. "Memory is fallible over 5 years. The signature remains valid." They were going to stonewall. They knew we didn't have time for a drawn-out fraud investigation. The injunction hearing was in 5 days. During the break, I went to the restroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked in the mirror, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink. I was shaking, not from fear, but from a rage so deep and dense it felt like lead in my chest. When I came out, Mom was standing in the hallway. She looked at me, her eyes red, but her posture rigid. "You could end this, Maya," she said quietly. "You have so much. Ethan is going to lose everything. They're going to take his house. Why are you being so greedy?" I stared at her. "He committed fraud, Mom. He lied to the EPA, and now Dad is perjuring himself for him. It's just money," she whispered, stepping closer, looking around to make sure the lawyers weren't in the hall. "Pay the settlement. Give Ethan $2 million. You'll make it back. If you don't, your father is going to take this all the way. He'll ruin your reputation. He'll drag your company through the mud until you lose that government contract. He told me he would." She wasn't asking me for mercy. She was delivering a threat. "If he ruins my company," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, "I won't have the money to pay you anyway, so what's the point? If he can't have it to save his son, he'll make sure you don't have it either," Mom said, staring right through me. "You know how he is." I walked away from her, back into the conference room. Garrett was waiting. "They won't crack," Garrett said quietly as I sat down. "The lawyer is good. He knows the flight manifest isn't enough to instantly dismiss the forged document without a handwriting expert's testimony, which takes weeks. They're pushing for the injunction." I looked across the table at Dad. He was sipping a glass of water, looking completely relaxed. He was willing to burn my life to the ground to keep his golden child warm. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Faye. "Emergency. Simone Ashby from the Depth of Interior just emailed. Someone tipped them off about the IP lawsuit. They are requesting a full audit of our legal standing by Friday. If we don't clear this, they freeze the contract." I stared at the screen. Dad hadn't just filed the suit. He had actively called my federal clients to sabotage me. He was accelerating the clock. He wanted me panicking. He wanted me to write a check today. I looked up from my phone. Dad was watching me. A faint, knowing smirk touched the corner of his mouth. I slid the phone across the glass table until it bumped against Garrett's legal pad. He glanced down. His eyes scanned Faye's text. He didn't sigh. He didn't blink. He just casually flipped his pen end over end and looked back up at my father. "Mr. Mercer," Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the polite deposition cadence. "Did you or anyone acting on your behalf contact the Department of the Interior this morning?" Dad's lawyer, a guy named Fletcher, sat forward. "Objection. Irrelevant to the scope of this IP dispute." "It's highly relevant," Garrett fired back. "If the plaintiff is engaging in tortious interference to extort my client, I'll ask again. Did you contact Simone Ashby at the Department of the Interior?" Dad kept that smug little smile. "I believe it's my civic duty to inform federal agencies when they are doing business with stolen assets. The taxpayers have a right to know." I felt my fingernails digging into my palms. He admitted it. He was proud of it. "I see," Garrett said. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a fresh stack of papers. "Let's talk about those assets then. You claim Maya developed TerraLens on your company hardware, specifically a server located in your former office on West 4th Street. Is that correct?" "Yes," Dad said. "She used the company mainframe." I almost laughed out loud. Mainframe. "It was 2018 when I built it, not 1995. He didn't even know the right terminology. "And you provided the baseline topographical data she used to train the algorithm?" Garrett pressed. "Of course. Here's my firm's proprietary land surveys, hundreds of them." "Fascinating," Garrett said. He slid a dense, spiral-bound technical report across the table. "Because the first iteration of TerraLens wasn't trained on construction surveys. It was built using open-source USDA soil erosion data from 2004, and it wasn't coded on a mainframe. The initial GitHub commits were pushed from a public IP address registered to the Boulder Public Library, from a machine with a MAC address belonging to a refurbished 2013 Lenovo laptop, a laptop Maya purchased at a pawn shop for $90, 3 months after you kicked her out of your house." Fletcher held up a hand. "We haven't reviewed this technical data. We'll need time to verify these claims." "Take all the time you need," Garrett said, leaning in. "But understand this, Fletcher. Your client is on the record under oath claiming he directed the development of a software platform he literally cannot describe, using hardware he never owned to produce a product that uses data he never possessed. And he just admitted, on the record, to calling a federal agency to leverage this fabricated lawsuit into a settlement. That isn't just just civil perjury. That is federal extortion. Dad's smirk finally faltered. He looked at Fletcher, waiting for his high-paid attack dog to bite back. But Fletcher was quiet. He was looking at the technical report, his brow furrowed. Lawyers like Fletcher don't mind being aggressive, but they hate being lied to by their own clients. It makes them look stupid. "We are taking a 10-minute recess," Fletcher said sharply, standing up. "We are done," Garrett corrected him, closing his briefcase. "You can buy a handwriting expert, Fletcher, but you can't buy an altered GitHub server log. Withdraw the injunction by 9 a.m. tomorrow, or I am sending this entire transcript to the U.S. Attorney's Office." Garrett stood up and motioned for me to follow. We walked out of the conference room without looking back. In the elevator, the adrenaline started to drain, leaving me lightheaded. "Did we win?" I asked, staring at the changing floor numbers. "We scared the shit out of his lawyer," Garrett said flatly. "Which is good. Fletcher is a shark, but he's a pragmatic shark. He took this case on contingency because your father promised him an easy multi-million-dollar settlement. Now Fletcher knows he's representing a liability. But the depth of interior," I reminded him. "Simone Ashby wants an audit by Friday. She doesn't care about GitHub logs. She cares about legal risk. If the lawsuit is still active on Friday, she freezes the contract." Garrett nodded grimly. "I know. We have to force them to drop the suit completely. Not just the injunction, the whole thing. I'm going to draft a motion for sanctions and push for an emergency dismissal, but judges move slowly. Your father knows he just has to drag his feet for 4 days to ruin you." I walked out into the crisp Denver air. The afternoon sun was blinding. I unlocked my Audi, got in, and just sat there for a long time before starting the engine. My phone vibrated. Mom again. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. I drove back to the Terra Lens office. The atmosphere was completely different from when I had left 3 hours ago. The usual hum of keyboards and low chatter was gone. People were talking in hushed clusters near the break room. When I walked past the glass-walled bullpen, a few developers looked away. Word had gotten out. Federal contracts are the lifeblood of a firm our size. If we lost it, 20 people lost their jobs. Faye was waiting in my office. She had the blinds drawn and was pacing in front of my whiteboard. "How bad is it?" she asked the second I closed the door. "He admitted to calling them," I said, dropping my bag on the couch. "He's trying to run out the clock until Friday. Garrett tore him apart on the technical specs, but the lawsuit is still officially filed. The bureaucracy at the Interior Department might not wait for a judge to clear it." Faye stopped pacing. She looked at me, her arms crossed, chewing on the inside of her cheek. Faye had been with me since the early days. She left a comfortable job at a massive tech conglomerate because she believed in what I was building. I paid her out of my own pocket for the first 6 months. "So we prove he's lying," Faye said. "We did. Garrett showed them the commit logs." "No," Faye said, shaking her head. "Logs can be disputed. Lawyers don't understand code. They understand paper. You said he forged a signature on an old employment NDA, right? From his contracting firm?" "Yeah, dated 5 years ago." "Where did he get the blank NDA?" Faye asked. I frowned, trying to remember the administrative mess of my father's old office. "He bought a generic boilerplate package online back in 2015. He used the same template for everyone. Roofers, foremen, secretaries, just printed them out and filled in the names." Faye's eyes lit up. She walked over to her laptop and opened it. "Maya, boilerplate templates get updated. Laws change. Clauses get rewritten. If he took an old signature of yours from a 2016 vendor ledger and copy-pasted it onto a blank NDA, where did he get the blank NDA recently?" I stared at her. The gears in my head started grinding. "His company went bankrupt 4 years ago. His old hard drives were repossessed by the liquidators." "Exactly," Faye said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "So he didn't use an old file. He went online recently to grab a fresh template to forge your name onto, but he backdated the signature line to 5 years ago." She turned the screen toward me. She had pulled up a PDF parsing tool. "I need Garrett to send me the exact digital file your father's lawyer submitted in discovery, the PDF of the signed NDA." I called Garrett immediately. He didn't ask questions. 2 minutes later, the file hit my inbox. I forwarded it to Faye. She dropped the PDF into her terminal and ran a metadata extraction script. Lines of white text cascaded down her black screen. She stopped the scrolling and pointed to a specific line. "Creator tool, Adobe Acrobat Pro DC 2023. Creation date, October 12, 2023. "Look at this," Faye whispered. "The metadata shows the PDF was generated 3 weeks ago, but that's not even the best part." She scrolled down to the embedded font data. "The document uses a specific font called Calibri Light, embedded. Microsoft didn't roll out this exact kerning update for Calibri until 2021. I felt a cold, sharp thrill run down my spine. "The document claims to be signed in 2018. It is physically impossible for this document to have existed in 2018, Faye said, leaning back in her chair with a vicious grin. "It's a digital anachronism. He literally built a time machine out of incompetence." I grabbed my phone and dialed Garrett again. "Tell me you have good news," Garrett answered, sounding exhausted. "I have a silver bullet," I said. "Faye audited the PDF of the NDA. It was created 3 weeks ago using a software version that didn't exist when it was supposedly signed. The font itself didn't exist." Garrett went completely silent on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of traffic outside his office window. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. "Faye can write a sworn affidavit as a software engineer right now. It's incontrovertible." Garrett let out a low whistle. "Okay, this changes things. Fletcher can argue about who owned what computer, but he cannot argue with metadata proving the core piece of evidence was fabricated post facto. He'd be risking disbarment for submitting fraudulent evidence. Will this be enough to get this suit dropped before Friday?" "I'm not waiting for a judge," Garrett said, his tone turning predatory. "I'm calling Fletcher right now. I'm going to tell him what we found. I'm going to give him exactly 1 hour to withdraw the lawsuit with prejudice, or I take this to the district attorney and press criminal charges for forgery and fraud against your father." "Do it," I said. I hung up the phone. Faye and I looked at each other. The tension in my office was still there, but it had morphed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the sharp anticipation of a trap springing shut. 45 minutes passed. I paced the length of my office. I looked out the window at the Denver skyline, watching the ant-like traffic below. My father had spent my entire life making me feel small. He had looked at me in that kitchen, handed a fortune to my siblings, and told me to leave my keys. He had treated me like an employee in my own family, and now he was about to find out exactly what kind of CEO he had forced me to become. My desk phone rang. I picked it up. "He folded," Garrett said simply. I closed my eyes. A massive, heavy breath escaped my lungs. "He dropped it?" "Fletcher called called me back panicking. He had no idea the document was forged. He's furious at your father. He formally withdrew the injunction and filed a motion to dismiss the entire suit with prejudice. It's over, Maya. They can't refile. I already forwarded the withdrawal notices to Simone Ashby at the Interior Department. Your federal contract is safe. I sat down heavily in my desk chair. Thank God. There is one more thing, Garrett added, his voice carefully neutral. Fletcher said your father was highly agitated when he confronted him about the metadata. He fired Fletcher on the spot. I don't care, I said. Let him be agitated. He's lucky I'm not pressing charges. Maya, Garrett said slowly. Fletcher mentioned your father said he was coming to see you. Personally, my stomach tightened. When? Now. Fletcher said he stormed out of his office about 15 minutes ago. I can send a courier over or call building security for you. I'll handle it, I said. I hung up. I looked at Faye. She had heard enough of my side of the conversation to know something was wrong. He's coming here, I told her. Faye stood up, her expression hardening. I'll go tell the front desk to lock the glass doors. He's not getting past the lobby. No, I said, standing up. Leave the doors unlocked. Tell security to stand down. Faye looked at me like I was crazy. Maya, if he's desperate, he is desperate, I said. And he's used to throwing tantrums until people give him what he wants. I spent 26 years managing his moods. I'm not hiding behind a security guard in my own company. I walked out of my office and stood in the center of the bullpen. The developers were quietly typing, but the underlying tension was palpable. Everyone, I said, pitching my voice so it carried across the open floor plan. 20 heads popped up over their monitors. The legal hold on the interior contract has been cleared. The lawsuit has been dismissed. A collective breath rushed out of the room. A few people clapped. One of the junior engineers slumped over his keyboard in relief. However, I continued, keeping my tone perfectly even, my father, the individual who filed the frivolous suit, is currently on his way up here. He is likely upset. If he enters the office, I want you all to remain at your desks. Do not engage him. Do not argue with him. Just let me handle it. I barely finished the sentence when the chime of the elevator echoed through the glass doors of the lobby. I turned around. Dad stepped off the elevator. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. His tie was loosened, and his face was a mottled, unhealthy red. He marched straight through the double glass doors, completely ignoring the receptionist who half stood to stop him. He stopped at the edge of the bullpen, looking around at the modern office, the row of sleek monitors, the massive TerraLens logo frosted on the glass walls. He looked at the empire I had manifested without a single cent of his money. Then his eyes locked onto me. I didn't move. I didn't invite him into my office to spare his feeling, and I didn't step backward. I just stood there in the center of the bullpen, my arms relaxed at my sides, letting him walk the final 20 feet under the fluorescent lights of my company. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. His breathing was heavy, his chest heaving under his wrinkled dress shirt. He looked around at the 20 software developers, engineers, and data analysts who were all sitting dead silent, staring right at him. You think you're extremely clever, don't you? He hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he was desperately trying to keep quiet. I think I know how to check a PDF's metadata, I said evenly, which is apparently more than you or Fletcher knew how to do. He stepped closer, trying to use his height, trying to invoke that old familiar shadow he used to cast over me when I was a teenager. You arrogant little girl. You manipulated the evidence. I know what you did. You had your computer people fake whatever that lawyer was talking about. If you truly believe that, Dad, then you should have told Fletcher to stay. You should have gone in front of a federal judge tomorrow and presented your 2018 contract typed in a 2021 font. But you didn't, because you know exactly what you did. I gave you everything, he suddenly yelled, his voice cracking, the polished businessman facade entirely gone. It echoed off the glass walls. A few developers physically flinched, but nobody looked away. You were living in my house. You ate my food. I gave you the work ethic to build all this, and you turn around and leave your brother to drown? You leave your own flesh and blood to the wolves? You left me in a gym parking lot in November, I said, my voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear it. I ate bulk rice for a month. My hands bled from hauling frozen meat. You didn't give me a work ethic. You gave me a survival complex because you abandoned me to fund Ethan's delusions. He is a visionary, Dad spat, pointing a shaking finger at my face. He is trying to build something that matters. You just build maps. You're a glorified accountant. This, he gestured wildly around the room, this is just a phase. When you lose that government contract, you'll be right back where you started. The Department of the Interior cleared our audit 10 minutes ago, I said calmly. The contract is secure. TerraLens is valued at $40 million. I own 80% of the equity. Your son is $4 million in debt, and his wellness retreat is currently being liquidated by federal regulators. I watched the words hit him. I watched the reality of the math sink in. He wasn't looking at his obedient daughter anymore. He was looking at a CEO who had just permanently dismantled him. Now, I said, raising my voice just enough to carry to the front desk, you have exactly 30 seconds to walk out of those glass doors before I have security physically remove you for trespassing. And if you ever contact me, my lawyers, or my clients again, I won't just file a restraining order. I will send the forged NDA to the district attorney, and I will watch you go to prison for fraud. He stared at me. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The blustering, overconfident contractor who had commanded our family kitchen like a king was suddenly just a tired, broke, aging man standing in a room full of people who belonged to me. He looked at Faye, who was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, glaring at him. He looked at the junior developers. He realized he had absolutely no power here. He turned around and walked out. He didn't look back as the elevator doors closed. The chime sounded, soft and pleasant, and he was gone. The bullpen remained silent for about 5 seconds. Then Faye let out a long, heavy exhale and clapped her hands together once. All right, everyone, she called out, her voice crisp and authoritative. Show's over. We have Q4 deliverables to finalize by Friday. Back to it. Slowly, the clatter of keyboards resumed. The low hum of conversation started up again. I turned and walked into my office, shutting the door behind me. I sat down at my desk, leaned my elbows on the smooth wood, and buried my face in my hands. I wasn't crying. I was just profoundly, deeply exhausted. Faye opened the door a minute later and set a glass of water on my desk. You handled that perfectly, she said quietly. I feel like I need a shower, I muttered, taking the glass. You defended your house. That's what a boss does. She tapped the edge of my desk. Go home, Maya. I'll oversee the afternoon commit. The interior data is locked and uploading. We're safe. I nodded. I grabbed my my coat and my bag, and I left. I drove back to my condo in silence, the same way I had driven to Denver all those years ago. But this time, I wasn't terrified. I was just hollow. I parked in my reserved spot in the underground garage, took the private elevator up to the lobby, and walked toward the concierge desk to get my mail. Marcus, the evening concierge, looked up as I approached. He had a slightly uncomfortable expression on his face. "Good evening, Ms. Mercer," he said, handing me a small stack of envelopes. You have a guest waiting in the lounge. I told her you were at the office and we don't allow unannounced visitors upstairs, but she insisted she was family. She's been sitting there for 2 hours. I stopped. I looked past Marcus's shoulder, through the slatted oak room divider that separated the lobby from the resident lounge. Sitting on a velvet sofa, staring blankly at a muted television screen, was my sister Celeste. I hadn't seen her in 3 years. The last time I saw her, she was in the kitchen watching Dad hand her that $850,000 check. She had been wearing a designer cashmere sweater, glowing with the smug satisfaction of being chosen. The woman on the sofa looked entirely different. She was wearing a faded, oversized hoodie and leggings. Her blonde hair, usually meticulously highlighted and styled, was pulled back in a messy, greasy knot. She was chewing furiously on her thumbnail, her leg bouncing up and down with nervous energy. She looked 10 years older, and she looked exhausted. I walked around the divider. She didn't notice me until I was standing directly in front of the coffee table. "Celeste!" She jumped, her head snapping up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she looked at me with a mixture of relief and absolute terror. "Maya!" she breathed, standing up quickly. She took a step toward me like she wanted to hug me, but I didn't move my arms, so she stopped awkwardly. I know you probably hate me. I know you don't want to see me. You're right on both counts," I said. "How did you get in here?" "I followed someone through the main door," she admitted, looking down at her scuffed sneakers. "Maya, please. I didn't know about the lawsuit. I swear to God I didn't. Dad and Ethan didn't tell me what they were doing until the lawyer dropped the case today. Ethan was screaming at Dad on the phone for an hour. It's a complete nightmare." "It's not my nightmare," I said, turning to walk toward the elevators. "Marcus can validate your parking." "They're taking the house, Maya." Her voice cracked, loud enough that a couple waiting by the elevators turned to look. I stopped. I slowly turned back around. "Whose house?" I asked. "Mom and Dad's," Celeste whispered, tears finally spilling over her lower lashes. She wiped them away frantically. "The retreat in Sedona. When the EPA shut down the expansion, the construction lenders called the loans. Ethan didn't have the cash. He had already spent everything Dad gave him on marketing and those stupid yurts. I know Ethan is bankrupt, Celeste. I don't care." "No, you don't understand," she pleaded, stepping closer. "Dad co-signed Ethan's commercial loans. When the bank came after Ethan, Dad panicked. He didn't want Ethan to go to jail for fraud because Ethan had lied on the loan applications about the zoning permits. So Dad leveraged his and Mom's house. He took out a massive second mortgage to pay off the immediate creditors, thinking he could get the money out of you with the lawsuit to pay it back." I stared at her, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Dad hadn't just sued me out of greed. He had sued me out of sheer catastrophic desperation. He had bet his own home on the assumption that I would fold. "And since your lawsuit blew up today," I said slowly, "the bank is foreclosing." "They missed 3 payments," Celeste sobbed quietly, wrapping her arms around herself. "The bank served them with the notice yesterday. They have 30 days to vacate. Mom is completely falling apart. She's packing boxes in the kitchen right now just crying. They have nothing, Maya. Dad's retirement is gone. The house is gone. Ethan's business is gone. And your $850,000? I asked coldly. "Why don't you bail them out? You were the other half of the golden legacy." Celeste looked away, her face flushing crimson. I invested it." "In what?" "In Ethan's retreat," she whispered. "He told me it was a guaranteed return. I gave him all of it. I'm broke too, Maya. I maxed out my credit cards just paying for my apartment in Scottsdale. I'm being evicted next week." They were all going down. The entire house of cards had collapsed, and they had managed to set fire to every single safety net they had. The schadenfreude should have felt good. It should have felt like the ultimate vindication. But looking at my sister shivering in a cheap hoodie in my lobby, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt disgusted. "Why are you here, Celeste?" I asked. "Are you asking me to buy Mom and Dad's house? Because I won't." "No," she said quickly. "No, I know you wouldn't do that. Dad made his bed." She looked back up at me, and I saw a new, calculating gleam in her teary eyes. The old Celeste was still in there somewhere, looking for an angle. "I'm not here for them. I'm here for me." I crossed my arms. "Explain." "I can give you Ethan," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The EPA fines? The loan fraud? Ethan has been hiding assets. He funneled about $200,000 out of the LLC into a private offshore account before the bankruptcy was declared. I have the ledger. I kept copies of his emails because I didn't trust him when he asked for my money." I narrowed my eyes. "Why would I care about Ethan's hidden assets?" "Because Dad doesn't know," Celeste said. "Dad lost his house trying to save Ethan, and Ethan is sitting on a secret cash reserve he plans to use to flee to Costa Rica once the bankruptcy finalizes. If you give me $50,000, just enough to clear my debts and get me a new apartment, I'll give you the flash drive. You can use it to destroy him. You can send him to federal prison." She stood there, offering me our brother's head on a platter for the price of a mid-sized sedan. She was willing to burn Ethan to the ground to save herself, just like Dad had been willing to burn me to save Ethan. The rot was so deep it was breathtaking. I stared at her. She was chewing her thumbnail again, looking at me with this hollow, frantic energy. She wasn't sorry for what she had done. She wasn't sorry for taking Dad's money while I was sleeping in a freezing Subaru. She was just terrified of being poor. "I'm not a pawn shop for family secrets, Celeste," I said. Her face dropped. The calculating look vanished, replaced instantly by raw, ugly panic. "Maya, please. I don't have first, last, and deposit for a new place. I have $90 in my checking account. My car is going to be repossessed on Friday. Then you should probably start looking for a bus pass," I said, my voice entirely flat. "I'm not giving you $50,000. I'm not buying our brother's freedom, and I'm not buying his prison sentence. I don't care what he did. I don't care what happens to him. You're a sociopath," she spat, her voice trembling. The tears were gone, replaced by a sudden venomous spite. "You sit up in your glass tower and you don't care about anyone but yourself. You're just like Dad." "I care about myself," I said, holding her gaze, "because when the lights went out, nobody else did. Good luck in Phoenix, Celeste." I turned and walked toward the elevators. I heard a sharp clatter behind me, something small and hard hitting the glass surface of the coffee table. "I'm leaving it," she called. called out, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet lobby. "I'm leaving for Arizona tomorrow. If you look at it, you owe me." I didn't turn around. I stepped into the elevator, swiped my fob, and pressed the button for the penthouse. The door slid shut on her standing there in her oversized hoodie. When I got into my condo, I dropped my keys on the counter, the heavy granite counter. I leaned against it for a second, just breathing in the quiet. My apartment smelled like clean linen and expensive cedar. It was perfectly temperature controlled. It was safe. I took off my coat, walked over to the kitchen island, and poured myself a glass of cold water from the fridge. My hand brushed against the pocket of my coat. I had picked it up. I didn't even consciously remember walking back to the coffee table, but I reached into my pocket and pulled it out. It was a cheap red plastic thumb drive, branded with a faded logo for some generic dental supply company. I set it on the marble counter. I stared at it. I should have thrown it in the trash. I had just spent the entire day fighting off my family's attempts to drag me down with them. The smart thing, the healthy thing, was to drop the drive down the garbage disposal and turn it on. But I am an analyst. I build systems to find the structural flaws hiding beneath the surface. It is my job to look at the dirt and see exactly where the foundation is going to crack. I took my laptop out of my bag, set it on the kitchen island, and plugged the drive in. Celeste was a mess of a human being, but her record-keeping was surprisingly meticulous. The drive contained 3 master folders. One was labeled Bank Statements. One was LLC Formation. The last one was simply Emails. I opened the bank statements first. It didn't take a forensic accountant to see the bleed. Ethan's retreat, Aura, had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years, but mixed in with the massive payouts to luxury yurt manufacturers and crystal wholesalers were steady, recurring transfers of $15,000, always on the first of the month, always categorized as consulting fees. I cross-referenced the routing numbers. The money wasn't going to an offshore account in the Caymans. Ethan wasn't that sophisticated. The money was being routed to a domestic shell company registered in Delaware called Apex Horizons LLC. I clicked over to the LLC Formation folder. Celeste had somehow gotten her hands on the incorporation documents. Apex Horizons was registered solely to Ethan. Over the last 2 years, while the retreat was failing, while he was dodging the EPA, while he was begging Dad for more money to stay afloat, Ethan had quietly siphoned a little over $240,000 of the retreat's operating capital into his own private life raft. It was textbook embezzlement. If the bankruptcy courts found this, Ethan would be looking at federal fraud charges. I felt a grim sense of validation, but not surprise. Ethan was a parasite. This was exactly what parasites did when the host started dying. I was about to eject the drive when I clicked on the final folder. Emails. There were only a dozen files in here, mostly PDF exports of email threads between Ethan and his construction foreman, proving Ethan knew the wetland permits were fake. I skimmed them. Then I saw the last file at the bottom of the list. The sender wasn't a contractor. It was an old AOL email address. Mom. The date on the email was from 4 months ago, right around the time the EPA officially shut down the construction site, triggering the default on the commercial loans, right around the time Dad panicked and took out the second mortgage on their house to hold off the creditors. I clicked the PDF. It was a reply to an email from Ethan. Ethan had written, "The bank is calling every day. Dad says he's going to talk to the loan officer on Tuesday. Should I transfer the Apex funds back to the main operating account? It's enough to cover the quarterly interest." Mom's reply was sent 3 hours later. "No, absolutely not. Do not tell your father about the Delaware account. If he knows you have cash, he will just hand it over to the bank to save the property. That money is your fresh start. We will figure out the house. I will manage your father. Keep the money hidden." I sat in my quiet, beautiful kitchen, and I felt the air leave my lungs. I read the 3 sentences again, and then a third time. Dad was a bully. He was arrogant, he was financially illiterate, and he was completely devoid of a moral compass when it came to getting what he wanted. He had committed perjury today. He had forged my signature. He had tried to extort me, his own daughter, out of millions of dollars to save his own skin. But he had done all of it because he thought he was backed into a corner. He had leveraged his retirement and his home because he thought his son was completely broke. He didn't know. Dad was out there setting himself on fire to keep Ethan warm, and Mom was the one holding the gasoline. Mom, who had stood in the hallway during the deposition and quietly threatened to ruin my reputation if I didn't pay up. Mom, who had played the helpless, distressed wife for 30 years, quietly stirring her matcha while Dad screamed at me to leave my keys on the counter. She knew Ethan had the money to save the house, and she told him to keep it, knowing Dad would gamble their entire livelihood instead. I closed the laptop. My hands were perfectly steady, but my heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The rot wasn't just deep, it was structural. The entire family was built on a foundation of parasitic betrayals, and they were all currently eating each other alive. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my king-sized bed, watching the headlights of cars trace lines across the ceiling of my bedroom. I thought about Dad's face in my office when he realized he had lost. I thought about Celeste shivering in the lobby. Thought about Mom packing boxes in a house that was being taken from her, knowing full well she had chosen her son's slush fund over her husband's solvency. By 6 a.m., the sky over Denver was a bruised, icy purple. I got up, made a pot of black coffee, and put on a pair of jeans and a heavy wool sweater. I took the red plastic thumb drive, dropped it into my coat pocket, and took the elevator down to the garage. The drive to the suburbs took 45 minutes, the reverse of the route I had driven in the shuddering Subaru 5 years ago. I merged onto the highway, keeping the radio off, just listening to the hum of the engine. The neighborhood looked exactly the same, but smaller. The manicured lawns, the wide driveways, the matching brick facades. It was a monument to upper-middle-class illusion. I pulled onto their street and slowed down. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. The lawn, which Dad used to obsess over, was overgrown and browning at the edges. A bright yellow piece of paper was taped to the glass of the front door, the notice of default. Sitting in the driveway was a rented U-Haul box truck. The loading ramp was pulled out, resting on the concrete. I parked the Audi on the street, right at the edge of the property line. I killed the engine and sat there for a minute, looking at the house. This was the place where I had spent 26 years being told I was too small, too boring, too practical to matter. The front door was propped open with a heavy terracotta planter. I got out of the car, the cold morning air biting at my face, and walked up the driveway. My boots crunched on the fallen leaves. I walked up the 3 concrete steps to the porch, stepped past the yellow notice taped to the glass, and walked into the foyer. The house was chaotic. Cardboard boxes were stacked waist-high against the dining room walls. The expensive Persian rugs had been rolled up and bound with twine. The walls looked bare, leaving lighter, unfaded squares of paint where the artwork used to hang. "Dad, I can't find the packing tape." The voice came from the kitchen. It was Mom. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the hardwood floors. I stopped in the archway of the kitchen, the exact spot I had stood with my suitcase 5 years ago. Mom was standing by the kitchen island, shoving bubble wrap into a box of crystal wine glasses. Her hair was messy, and she was wearing an oversized gray sweater. She looked exhausted, her face lined and pale without her usual makeup. She turned around, expecting to see Dad. When she saw me, she froze. The roll of bubble wrap slipped out of her hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. She stared at me. Her mouth opened, but it took her a few seconds to find her voice. "Maya," she whispered. "Hi, Mom," I said. She took a step backward, bumping into the granite counter. Her eyes darted toward the hallway behind me like she was expecting security guards or police officers to follow me in. What are you doing here?" "I came to see the house," I said, keeping my voice completely neutral. I looked around the kitchen. The espresso machine was already packed. The breakfast nook was covered in old newspapers and moving boxes. "It looks different." "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rising in pitch, a frantic edge creeping in. "Your father went to the hardware store to get more boxes. If he comes back and sees you here, after what you did to us yesterday—" "After what I did to you?" I repeated, leaning casually against the door frame. "You sued me for my company, Mom. You forged my name on a legal document and tried to bankrupt my firm to cover Ethan's debts." "We were desperate," she cried, gripping the edge of the island. "We are losing our home. We have 30 days to get out, and we have nowhere to go. You have millions of dollars, Maya. You could have fixed this with a stroke of a pen. You could have saved your family." "I could have," I agreed softly. "But why would I use my money to save the house when Ethan has $240,000 sitting in a Delaware LLC right now?" The color entirely drained from her face. It was instantaneous. One second she was flushed with defensive anger, and the next she looked like a corpse. She stopped breathing. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the red plastic thumb drive, and placed it gently on the edge of the counter. It sat there, bright and glaring against the dark granite. "Celeste stopped by my building last night," I told her, watching her eyes stay locked on the drive. "She's broke. She's being evicted. She offered to sell Ethan out to me for 50 grand. I didn't pay her, of course, but she left her files anyway. She had his bank statements, Mom. She had the incorporation docs for Apex Horizons." Mom swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking visibly now. "Maya, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I said, stepping fully into the kitchen. "I read your email, the one where you told Ethan to hide the money from Dad, the one where you told him to let Dad leverage the house so Ethan could keep his slush fund safe." She pressed a hand to her mouth, a small, choked sob escaping her throat. She looked utterly pathetic. The quiet, passive enabler finally dragged into the light. "He's my boy," she whispered, tears spilling over her cheeks. He's not strong like you, Maya. He doesn't know how to survive. If he lost everything, he wouldn't make it. Your father and I, we can rebuild. But Ethan needs a cushion. I had to protect him." "You let Dad commit perjury," I said, my voice hardening, dropping the casual act. "You let Dad risk federal prison by extorting a government contractor. You let him lose the house you've lived in for 30 years, and you did it while knowing exactly where the money was to stop it." "Please," she begged, taking a step toward me, reaching out a trembling hand. "Please, Maya, don't tell your father. If he knows I hid this from him, if he knows Ethan had the money, it will kill him. It will destroy whatever is left of this family." "This family has been destroyed for a long time, Mom. You just finally ran out of money to cover up the smell." I heard the heavy rumble of a truck pulling into the driveway outside, the squeal of brakes, a car door slamming shut. Mom's head snapped toward the front window. Absolute terror washed over her features. "He's back! Maya, please, take the drive. Leave out the back door. I'm begging you." I looked at the red plastic drive sitting on the counter. I looked at the woman who had stirred her tea while I was thrown to the wolves. The heavy front door opened, the terracotta planter scraping against the hardwood. "Martha, they were out of the large wardrobe boxes." Dad's voice boomed from the foyer, tired but still carrying that old, commanding weight. "We're going to have to use the medium ones for the linens." Heavy footsteps started walking down the hall toward the kitchen. Mom looked at me, her eyes wide, silent tears streaming down her face, silently pleading with me to grab the drive and run. I didn't move a single muscle. Dad stepped into the kitchen archway carrying a stack of flattened cardboard boxes. He stopped dead in his track. The boxes slipped from his grip, fanning out across the floor. He looked at me, his face immediately darkening into a familiar, violent scowl. The humiliation of yesterday's defeat was still fresh, and seeing me standing in his ruined kitchen was a match to gasoline. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Just catching up with Mom," I said. Dad stepped forward, his fists clenching. "Get out! You did your damage. You want to come gloat? You want to watch us pack? Get out of my house before I call the police for trespassing." "You don't own this house anymore, Dad," I reminded him. "The bank does." He took another step, his face turning red. I said, "Get out!" "Richard, stop!" Mom suddenly shrieked, stepping between us. She put her hands on his chest, pushing him back. "Just leave her alone! Let her go!" Dad looked down at Mom, confused by her panic. Then his eyes drifted past her, scanning the kitchen. They landed on the kitchen island. He saw the red plastic thumb drive sitting on the granite. He frowned. He looked back at me, then down at the drive, then at Mom's terrified, tear-streaked face. The bluster faded from his eyes, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion. "What is that?" he asked, his voice losing its volume. Mom didn't answer. She just stood there, her hands still pressed against his chest, her breathing shallow and fast. "It's a gift from Celeste," I said, breaking the silence. Dad pushed past Mom, brushing her aside. He walked up to the island and stared down at the small piece of plastic. He didn't touch it. He looked back up at me. "What's on it, Maya?" he asked. The anger was gone now. There was just a heavy, dreadful exhaustion in his voice. "Financial records," I said. "From Ethan's LLC, the one in Delaware." Dad's brow furrowed. "Ethan doesn't have an LLC in Delaware. Aura is registered in Arizona." "He has two," I corrected him. "Aura is in Arizona. Apex Horizons is in Delaware. It's the consulting firm he set up to pay himself out of the the retreat's operating budget. Dad stared at me. The words were hitting him, but the meaning was struggling to penetrate 30 years of blind faith. What are you talking about? Ethan didn't have any money. The EPA fines wiped him out. That's why the bank called the loans. Ethan has $240,000 sitting in a checking account in Wilmington, I said, my voice quiet and steady in the dead air of the kitchen. He's been transferring 15 grand a month to himself for the last 2 years. He had the money to pay the commercial loans, Dad. He just didn't want to use his own cash. Dad didn't move. He didn't speak. He just slowly turned his head to look at Mom. Mom was backed against the sink, her hands covering her mouth, shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't meet his eyes. Martha, Dad said, his voice cracking slightly. Is she lying? Mom squeezed her eyes shut. She shook her head, a tiny, pathetic movement. Dad's face went entirely slack. The imposing figure, the man who commanded rooms and demanded loyalty, seemed to physically shrink inside his clothes. He looked back at the drive. He had the money? Dad whispered. Well, I took the second mortgage? Well, I leveraged this house. He had the cash? He asked Mom if he should use it to pay the bank, I said. I wasn't going to let her hide. Not anymore. Dad's head snapped back to me. What? It's in the emails on that drive, I told him, pointing at the red plastic. Ethan asked Mom if he should transfer the money back to save the house. Mom told him no. She told him to keep it hidden from you, so you would take the fall and Ethan could keep his fresh start. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a structural collapse. The sound of a man realizing that the foundation he had built his entire identity on was made of sand, and his own wife had washed it away. Dad dropped his hands to his sides. The flattened cardboard boxes at his feet seemed to mock him. The physical proof of his ruin scattered across the hardwood. He didn't yell. That was the most terrifying part. For my entire life, Richard Mercer's anger was a loud, explosive thing. It shattered plates. It slammed doors. It demanded that everyone in the room shrink to accommodate it. But now, he was just incredibly quiet. He looked at Mom. You told him to hide it. Richard, please, Mom choked out, the tears flowing freely now, ruining the collar of her gray sweater. The bank was going to take it all. I had to make sure he had something left. If he went bankrupt, he would have nothing. You know how he gets when he fails? You let me put a second mortgage on this house, Dad said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. Our home, the house we raised our children in. You watched me sit at the dining room table and sign the papers to give this place to the bank. I thought we could pay it off, she sobbed, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out in a desperate pleading gesture. I thought you could get the money from Maya's company. I thought if we just squeezed her a little, she'd pay the settlement and we could cover the mortgage and Ethan could keep his nest egg. I watched my mother admit out loud that she viewed me as nothing more than a fleshy ATM, a disposable asset meant to be liquidated to cushion my brother's ego. It didn't even hurt. The nerve endings were completely dead. Dad looked at her outstretched hands and took a step back as if she were carrying a disease. He flinched away from her touch. He turned his gaze back to the kitchen island. He walked over to it, his heavy boots, slow and deliberate. He reached out and picked up the red plastic thumb drive. It looked tiny in his thick, calloused palm. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at me. Is this everything? He asked. Every bank statement, every transfer, every email, I said. Celeste made sure it was comprehensive. She was hoping to sell it. Dad let out a short, humorless breath that sounded almost like a cough. Of course she was. He closed his fist around the drive. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize for yesterday, for the forged documents, for trying to destroy my life's work. He just looked at me with hollow, defeated eyes, a man who had finally realized he was entirely alone in a house full of people. I'm going to leave now, I said. I didn't wait for a response. I turned around and walked out of the kitchen. I stepped over the scattered cardboard boxes in the hallway. I walked through the foyer, past the front door with the bright yellow foreclosure notice taped to the glass, and stepped out into the biting morning air. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. The next 3 days were a masterclass in compartmentalization. I went back to my office, back to the clean, logical world of topographical maps and geospatial data. Faye and I finalized the Q4 deliverables for the Department of the Interior. The upload went flawlessly. We secured the second phase of the federal contract, guaranteeing our revenue for the next 2 years. I took the entire office out for a catered lunch on Thursday to celebrate. We sat on the rooftop patio of a restaurant in downtown Denver, laughing, drinking sparkling water, and talking about server upgrades. I looked around the table at my team. They were smart, capable, and loyal. I had built a family. I just had to interview them first. Everything felt perfectly aligned. The mess was contained. I had cut the infection out. Then, on Friday morning, my cell phone rang. I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing a commercial zoning report for a new client in Texas. My phone was resting on the wireless charging pad. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number from an Arizona area code. Normally, I let unknown numbers go to voicemail, but a strange, cold intuition washed over me. I picked it up. Maya speaking. You ruined me. The voice was ragged, pitched high with panic, and completely devoid of its usual arrogant drawl. It was Ethan. I leaned back in my desk chair and looked out the window at the skyline. Hello, Ethan. I assume Dad paid you a visit? He didn't visit, Ethan screamed into the phone, the audio clipping from the sheer volume of his voice. He didn't even call. Do you know what he did, Maya? Do you have any idea what you unleashed? I gave him a thumb drive, I said calmly. What he did with it was entirely his choice. He took it to the bank. Ethan was hyperventilating now, the words tumbling out of him in a frantic, wet rush. He didn't even confront me. He took that drive straight to Duncan, the commercial loan officer who underwrote the retreat. He gave the bank the offshore account numbers. He gave them Mom's emails. I stopped spinning a pen between my fingers. I set it down on the desk. Dad hadn't just gotten angry. Dad had gone nuclear. He showed them the fraud, I summarized. He's trying to trade me to save his house, Ethan yelled, sounding like a terrified child. He told the bank that I committed loan fraud, that I hid assets during the default, and he offered them the Delaware LLC to clear his second mortgage. The bank froze my accounts this morning, Maya. All of them. Apex Horizons is locked. My personal checking is locked. I tried to buy a coffee an hour ago and my card was declined. I let the silence hang on the line for a moment. It was a beautiful, symmetrical piece of justice. Dad had tried to throw me to the federal government to save Ethan. When that failed, he threw Ethan to the bank to save himself. It sounds like you need a lawyer, Ethan, I said softly. I can't afford a lawyer, he sobbed. The guru, the visionary shifting global consciousness business, was crying over a declined debit card in a coffee shop. They froze everything. The bankruptcy trustee just called me. They're looping in federal regulators. If they prove I hid that cash before the default, it's a felony. I'm going to prison, Maya. They're going to put me in a federal penitentiary. That does seem to be the standard penalty for embezzlement and federal loan fraud, I agreed. You have to help me, he begged. The pivot from screaming anger to pathetic pleading gave me whiplash. You have millions. You just secured that government contract. Mom told me you won the lawsuit. Please, Maya, I need a retainer for a criminal defense attorney. Just $50,000. It's nothing to you. It's pocket change. I closed my eyes. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of my bloodline. 2 days ago, Celeste asked for $50,000 to sell him out. Today, he was asking for $50,000 to save himself. They all thought my bank account was a communal well they could dip their buckets into whenever they set their own lives on fire. Ethan, I said, my voice completely flat. 2 weeks ago, you emailed me asking me to falsify an EPA survey which would have sent me to federal prison. When I said no, you and Dad forged my signature and filed a fraudulent lawsuit that almost bankrupted my company. You tried to destroy my entire life so you could keep playing pretend in Sedona. I was desperate, he cried. Dad made me do it. Dad didn't make you hide $250,000 from him while he mortgaged his house. You did that all on your own. You are a parasite, Ethan, and the host is finally dead. Maya, please, do not ever call this number again. I hung up. I blocked the Arizona number. I put the phone face down on my desk. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet hum of the office wash over me. It was over. The circle of destruction was complete. They were all going to face the exact consequences of their own actions, and I was entirely insulated. I opened the zoning report on my monitor and started typing. 20 minutes later, my office line buzzed. It was Faye. Hey, Faye said, her voice tight and strictly professional. Are you busy? Just finishing the Texas report, I said. What's up? You have a visitor in the lobby. I frowned. I glanced at my calendar. It was completely clear until a 2 p.m. Zoom call. I don't have any meetings scheduled. Is it a vendor? No, Faye said, her voice dropping lower. It's a man. He asked for you by name. I told him you were booked, but he said it was a legal matter regarding Richard Mercer. My stomach tightened. Dad wouldn't dare come back here. Not after the threat I made. Did he give a name? I asked. He handed the receptionist a card. Faye said. His name is Conrad Whitfield. He says he's a forensic auditor with the federal bankruptcy court. Send him up to conference room B, I said. And Faye, call Garrett. Tell him I need him on a secure line in 5 minutes. On it, Faye said, and the line clicked dead. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel the cold dread that used to wash over me whenever my father's name was mentioned in a legal context. I just felt a deep, profound exhaustion with the sheer collateral radius of my family's incompetence. I walked out of my office, past the bullpen where my engineers were quietly working, and into conference room B. A moment later, the glass door opened and Conrad Whitfield walked in. He didn't look like a federal agent from a movie. He didn't have a badge clipped to his belt or a severe, intimidating posture. He looked like a government accountant who had missed his last 3 lunch breaks. He was wearing a slightly rumpled beige suit, carrying a worn leather briefcase, and he looked incredibly tired. Ms. Mercer, he said, extending a hand. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. Have a seat, Mr. Whitfield, I said, shaking his hand and gesturing to the long glass table. My corporate counsel is dialing in as we speak. Right on cue, the speakerphone in the center of the table chimed. Garrett's voice came through, crisp and alert. Maya, I'm here. Garrett, I said. I'm sitting with Conrad Whitfield from the federal bankruptcy court. He's here regarding my father. Mr. Whitfield, Garrett said smoothly over the speaker, to what do we owe the pleasure? Terra Lens has no financial entanglement with Richard Mercer or any of his former entities. I know, Conrad said, pulling a legal pad out of his briefcase. I'm not here to audit Terra Lens. I'm here because of an incident that occurred at a Chase Bank branch in Scottsdale 3 hours ago. Conrad clicked his pen. He looked up at me, his expression perfectly neutral. Your father walked into the commercial lending department this morning and handed a branch manager a red plastic thumb drive, Conrad explained. He claimed the drive contained proof that his son, Ethan Mercer, had embezzled $250,000 from Aura LLC prior to its insolvency. Your father explicitly offered this drive to the bank on the condition that they forgive his secondary mortgage and halt the foreclosure on his primary residence. I kept my face entirely blank. And, Conrad sighed, your father fundamentally misunderstands how commercial banking regulations work. A loan officer cannot barter a civil mortgage default in exchange for evidence of a federal felony. The branch manager immediately contacted their compliance department, who contacted the DOJ, who contacted my office. The bank took the drive, initiated a hard freeze on all of Ethan Mercer's accounts, and proceeded with the foreclosure on your father's home anyway. I couldn't help it. A tiny, grim smile touched the corner of my mouth. Dad had tried to play hardball with a massive financial institution using stolen evidence, thinking he was still the king of the negotiating table. He ended up handing them the bullet to shoot his son, and they took his house anyway. What does this have to do with Maya? Garrett asked over the speaker. When the bankruptcy trustee contacted Ethan Mercer to inform him his accounts were frozen pending a federal fraud investigation, Mr. Mercer became highly distressed, Conrad said diplomatically. He claimed that the data on the drive was fabricated. Specifically, he claimed that you, Maya, had illegally breached his personal servers, manipulated the ledgers to frame him, and given the drive to your father in an act of corporate retaliation. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass. Ethan is claiming I hacked him? He is, Conrad said. Which brings me here. I need to ask you, on the record, if you engaged in any unauthorized access of Aura LLC's financial systems, or if you created the documents on that drive. No, I said simply. My sister, Celeste, compiled those documents. She maintained copies of Ethan's emails and bank statements. She brought the drive to my residential building on Wednesday evening, hoping to sell it to me for $50,000 to clear her own debts. I refused. She left the drive on a table in my lobby. I took it to my parents' house yesterday morning, set it on the kitchen counter, and told my father what was on it. What he did with it after that was his decision. Conrad didn't look surprised. He just made a neat little check mark on his legal pad. Can you corroborate that your sister brought it to your building? He asked. My evening concierge, Marcus, can pull the lobby security footage from Wednesday night. It will show her sitting in the lounge talking to me and leaving the drive on the coffee table. Excellent, Conrad said. He closed his legal pad. That aligns perfectly with the metadata on the drive. We already verified the source IP addresses for the bank downloads. They trace back to to an apartment in Scottsdale registered to Celeste Mercer. Ethan's claim that you fabricated the data was a desperate lie. We just needed to close the loop. Is that it? Garrett asked, sounding slightly disappointed that he didn't get to yell at anyone. That's it, Conrad said, standing up and snapping his briefcase shut. I apologize for the intrusion, Ms. Mercer. The court is preparing to file formal charges against your brother by Monday. Given the paper trail your sister so thoroughly documented, he will likely be facing 3 to 5 years in a federal facility. Your father is also being investigated for attempting to use stolen assets to extort a federally insured bank, though the DA might let that go since he just lost his home and his retirement. Conrad stopped at the door and looked back at me. Your family is quite the case study, Ms. Mercer. We're estranged, I said. Have a safe flight back to Arizona, Mr. Whitfield. He nodded once and walked out. I sat in the quiet conference room for a moment. The speakerphone buzzed. Maya? Garrett asked. Are we clear? We're clear, Garrett, I said softly. Thank you. I ended the call. I stood up from the glass table and walked back out into the main office. The afternoon sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, golden geometric shapes across the carpet. The low, steady hum of my company was the only sound. Keyboards clicking, servers quietly processing data, people building things that actually worked based on math that didn't lie. I walked back into my corner office and shut the door. I walked over to the window and looked out at the Denver skyline, the jagged peaks of the Rockies rising up in the distance. 5 years ago, I drove toward those mountains in a shaking car, terrified, abandoned, and entirely alone. My father had told me to leave my keys on the counter. He had told me to be a woman. I looked down at the street below, watching the tiny cars move in orderly lines. They were gone. The entire toxic, heavy, suffocating weight of them was finally, permanently gone. They had eaten each other alive, right down to the bone, and I hadn't had to lift a single finger to help them do it. I just had to step out of the way. I walked back to my desk, sat down in my leather chair, and woke up my monitors. The Q4 commercial zoning report for the Texas client was still open, waiting for my final approval. I adjusted my keyboard, took a slow, deep breath of the perfectly clean, quiet air, and went back to work.